Chapter 5. Granny Moves In. Nobody felt the death of Mrs. Jinks more keenly than Joe. It was as if he had lost his only friend, which, in a way, he had. And not only was she dead, but she had been branded a thief, and that hurt him all the more. The truth will always come out. That was what she had said to him. But how could he go to his parents or the police and tell them that it was Granny who had taken the jewellery and the gold teeth, and that it was she who had killed Mrs. Jinks by pouring gravy powder over her when the police dogs were near, because what reason could there possibly be? They'd think he'd gone mad. Every day when he got home from school, Joe found himself on his own. He took to walking down to the bottom of the garden where Mr. Lampy would be waiting for him, and the two of them would sit together next to a burning brazier with the family of moles watching them through the window of the shed. "I'm going to run away," he would say. "I'll go to China and work in a paddy field." "I don't know, Master Warden," Mr. Lampy would reply. "China's a long way away, and who's this paddy you're talking about?" Meanwhile, Mr. and Mrs. Warden had problems of their own. The summer holiday was about to start, and that meant the departure of Wolfgang and Irma. Every year the cook and her husband went home to Hungary, although, as they only owned a caravan just outside Budapest, Mr. Warden would have much preferred it if the home had come to them. What it meant was that for 3 weeks there would be no cook and no butler. Worse still, Mrs. Warden had been unable to find a new nanny to look after Joe, even though she'd advertised. The fact that the last nanny had just been eaten by 2 dogs probably didn't help. "We've got to find someone to look after Jordan," Mrs. Warden said the night after Wolfgang and Irma had gone. What did you say?" Mr. Warden was lying in bed, smoking a cigar and reading The Economist. Mrs. Warden pivoted around upside down. She had recently begun a course in escapology, and as well as being handcuffed, straitjacketed, and sellotaped, she was also tied by one foot to the chandelier. "I said we've got to find someone to look after Jordan." "Oh, yes, but who?" "I was thinking about Mr. Lampy." "Mr. Lampy? He's just the gardener, and he's over 80, completely senile." Mrs. Warden tugged with her teeth at one of the ropes that bound her. It wouldn't give. "We could ask Mabel Butterworth. She's an angel." "You're absolutely right," Mr. Warden said. "She died 2 years ago." "Did she?" Mrs. Warden blinked. "No wonder she hasn't been returning my calls." She considered for a moment. "How about Barbara Feingold? She always says how much she likes kids." "But she means goats," Mr. Warden said. "She's always had a fondness for goats. She keeps 2 of the brutes as pets." "Well, there must be someone." "How about you?" Mr. Warden suggested. "After all, you are the boy's mother." "Hadn't thought of that," Mrs. Warden muttered. "I suppose it's an idea. I mean, I could look after him for a few days." Mrs. Warden twisted round again, trying to release a hand from the straitjacket without dislocating her shoulder. Nothing happened. "Oh, this isn't working," she sighed. "I'm sorry, Gordon, but I'm afraid you're going to have to untie me. Gordon? Gordon?" But Mr. Warden had fallen sound asleep. The next day did not begin well. Mrs. Warden had a headache from sleeping upside down, and had no wish to be left alone with Joe. Mr. Warden had left early for the office, even though, as Mrs. Warden realised an hour after he was gone, it was Saturday. Joe was waiting for her in the kitchen, studying a map of China. "Good morning, Jordan," she said. Joe looked up. He had been thinking about life in Chuanping. "Now," Mrs. Warden went on, "I'm just going to make you some breakfast. Then I'm afraid I have a hair appointment, and then my bridge lesson with Dr. Vitebsky. This week we're learning about suspension bridges. So will you all be all right on your own until lunch?" Joe nodded. "Good." Mrs. Warden was in a hurry. She threw a spoonful of coffee granules into her mouth and sipped some boiling water from the kettle. "I'd love to have lunch with you," she went on, "but I'm meeting Jane for 11sies, and as she's always late, it's bound to be 12sies. The poor dear is all at 6s and 7s. Maybe I'll buy her some after 8s. Joe had lost count trying to work this out, but his mother went on anyway. "I'm going shopping this afternoon," she said. "I thought I'd go to the spring sales. The sofa in the living room needs some new springs. Then tea at the Ritz, and I should be home in time for supper." "Do you want me to make the supper?" Joe asked. "I don't think so, darling," Mrs. Warden giggled. "Leave that to me." But in fact, she was so exhausted after her day's shopping that she quite forgot to cook. That evening, Mr. Warden and Joe sat at the table staring gloomily at 3 tins of pink salmon. Mrs. Warden was even gloomier. She couldn't find the tin opener. "This house is going to the dogs," Mr. Warden muttered, "and I'm going to a hotel." Mrs. Warden burst into tears. "It's not my fault," she wept. "I've been so busy. How can I be expected to do everything?" "Well, is there no food in the house?" Mr. Warden asked. "There was a chicken and some peas." "You could at least have cooked the peas," Mr. Warden growled. "I tried to, but the chicken ate them, and then I tried to cook the chicken, but it ran away." The days without Wolfgang and Irma crawled slowly by. Mrs. Warden filled the house with ready meals. Mr. Warden spent longer and longer at the office, and Joe began to teach himself Chinese. But quite rapidly things began to fall apart. On Tuesday night the dishwasher broke down, much to the horror of Mrs. Warden, who hadn't washed a dish herself since 1963, and then she'd only rinsed it. The next day she went out and bought 100 paper plates, which were fine with the main courses and puddings but caused problems with the soup. On Wednesday, Mr. Warden attempted to dry his shoes by placing them in the microwave. His feet were actually glowing as he took the tube to work, and he caused a bomb scare at Charing Cross. On Thursday, the toaster exploded when Mr. Warden tried to light it with a match. On Friday, it was the Hoover. Mrs. Warden only just escaped a terrible injury when she tried to use it to blow-dry her hair. You may think it pathetic that Mr. and Mrs. Warden were so incapable of looking after themselves, but you'd be surprised how true this is of the very rich. They've been looked after by servants for so long that they don't know how to do anything for themselves. Ask the Queen what a Brillo pad is, and she'd probably tell you it was a lovely place to live. Anyway, as the week progressed, the house became dustier and dirtier and more broken down. Joe, for the most part, avoided his parents and spent most of his time with Mr. Lampy. Chinese had proved impossible to learn, so he was thinking about volunteering for the American shuttle to Mars. And then, on Saturday, Granny came to lunch. "You know, Maud, darling," she said, munching on a mouthful of Marks and Spencer's instant Saturday lunch, "you and Gordon look terribly tired." "I am tired," Mr. Warden muttered. "Don't you usually go to the south of France at this time of the year?" "We can't, Mumsy," Mrs. Warden sighed. "Why ever not?" Granny had hardly glanced at Joe, sitting opposite her at the table, but he was suddenly suspicious. Granny knew perfectly well that his parents had a flat in Cannes. She also knew that the flat had only one bedroom. "What about Jordan?" Mrs. Warden said. "I'm sure he'd love to go with you." "There's no room," Mr. Warden muttered. "Well," there was a pause, "I could look after him while you were away." Joe's mouth went dry. One after another the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Alone with Granny? He'd prefer to be alone with a saber-toothed tiger. "I could move in if you wanted me to," she went on. Her whole face had gone rubbery and there was a sweetness in her voice. But Joe could see her eyes. They were still sly. "Joe would love it, wouldn't you, dear?" "Ah!" Joe yelled. For even as Granny had spoken the words, he had felt a terrible explosion of pain. Under the table, a leather-caped shoe had just come into hard contact with his knee. "Oh, I'm sorry, dear." Granny gazed at him inquiringly. "You can't," Joe gasped. "What?" Mr. Warden was furious. "Your Granny offers to look after you and that's all you can say?" I mean, it isn't fair on Granny." Joe was blushing now. Could he tell the truth? That was what Mrs. Jinks had advised, but looking at his parents now, he knew it was impossible. He forced himself to think. "I'd love to be with Granny," he went on, "but wouldn't it be too much work for her? It might make her ill." "Oh, silly me," Granny trilled. "I've dropped my fork." She disappeared under the table. "Wait a minute," Joe began. "What is the matter with you, Jordan?" his mother asked. A second later, Joe jerked upright in his seat as 3 metal prongs buried themselves in his thigh. He had been holding a glass of water, but now he cried out and his hand jerked and the water sprayed over his father, putting out his cigar. "Have you gone mad?" Mr. Warden demanded. "No, father, Joe put down the glass and reached under the table. There were 3 holes in his trousers, not to mention in his leg. "I'll look after him." Granny was already back in her seat. For someone so old, she had moved incredibly fast. "It would only be for a few weeks. I'm sure we'd have lots of fun." Joe stared at her. Granny leaned forward and picked up the bread knife. 13 inches of serrated steel. She looked at him and smiled. Joe shrank back into his chair. When he spoke, his voice was thin and high-pitched. "What about Mr. Lampy?" he quavered. "What about him?" his mother said. "He's a lot younger than Granny. Couldn't he look after me? That way you and father could have your holiday. Granny wouldn't have to bother about me and everyone would be happy." Across the table, Granny was gripping the bread knife so tightly that her fingers had gone white and the veins were wriggling under the skin like worms. Joe held his breath, his eyes fixed on the knife. "I did suggest Mr. Lampy," Mrs. Warden said. "Maybe it's not such a bad idea," Mr. Warden muttered. "I think it's a very good idea." Granny put down the knife. Her lips had gone all wobbly and there were tears brimming in her eyes like rainwater in the folds of a tent. "Well, if you don't want me," she burbled. "If you don't like me." "Of course he likes you, Mummy," Mrs. Warden said. "Jordan was just worried about you, that's all." "I certainly was," Joe agreed. "Well, all right." Granny forced herself to cheer up. "You get your tickets then and have a lovely time." But then her eyes narrowed and the next words were aimed directly at Joe. "And if anything terrible happens to Mr. Lampy, if he's unlucky enough to have a dreadful accident in the next few days, just you let me know." "Now, don't you worry about me, Master Warden," Mr. Lampy said. It was the morning before Mr. and Mrs. Warden were about to leave. Mr. Lampy had just come out of the shed carrying a canister of petrol. He had been cutting back the shrubbery at the bottom of the garden and was about to light a bonfire. "You and me, we're going to get along all right." "That's not what I'm worried about," Joe replied. "It's Granny." "You and your Granny." Mr. Lampy set the canister down and rubbed the small of his back. "Oh," he exclaimed. "I've been to see the doctor today and he goes on about someone called arthritis." "Arthritis? I never heard of him." "Please, Mr. Lampy." Mr. Lampy smiled. He was a very old man, and when he smiled his face folded into 100 creases. He had spent his whole life out of doors. In 10 years in the Navy, he had never once gone below deck, all the more remarkable when you consider that he had served on a submarine. "I haven't seen your Granny and I don't intend to see her," he went on. He leaned down and picked up the petrol canister. "I reckon she'll be leaving the 2 of us alone." Joe watched as Mr. Lampy walked away. He wasn't convinced, but there seemed to be no point in arguing any more. And the last thing he saw of Mr. Lampy was the old gardener leaning over a great pile of wood cuttings and leaves, sprinkling it with petrol from the canister. He didn't see Mr. Lampy light the match. The explosion could be heard 30 miles away, and at first the police thought it was a terrorist attack. Like Mrs. Jinks before him, nothing was found of Mr. Lampy, which was hardly surprising. He had blown a crater 5 metres deep in the earth. 4 trees, the rockery, the garden shed and the moles went with him, blown into so many pieces that it was quite impossible to say what belonged to what. One question puzzled everyone. How had Mr. Lampy managed to sprinkle nitroglycerine on his bonfire? And how had it got into what should have been a canister of petrol? The investigation led nowhere. One witness did come forward claiming that he had seen a figure climbing over the fence into the garden of Thattleby Hall. But as the witness had been on his way back from the pub, and as he insisted that the figure he had seen had been a woman and one who was over 90 years old, his evidence was discounted. A few days later, Mr. and Mrs. Warden left for their flat in the south of France. The same day, Granny moved in.